Today we're reviewing this light-based 600 case by Be Quiet! Exclamation point. Period. The period's because it was the end of the sentence I was saying. So this case is pretty interesting because it can be presented in 3 different ways. So they have this intentional, flat, sort of traditional old school desktop presentation. It can be stood up into standard by attaching these feet to it on one of the 2 sides, or they can be attached to what would be the traditional top of the case to turn it into an inverted solution. And so mechanically, this is kind of a brilliant but very simple design. This case is going up against some really heavy competition. So that's $150 to $195 depending on the SKU. This is one of the competitors. So that's the Montech King 95 Pro. We have a lot of testing on that one. It has a mesh or a glass front option. This is the Hyte Y70. Got this sort of chamfered front edge. So that's the unique aspect there. And then this is the Antec C8, which is one of the more affordable dual chamber cases that's bottom intake focused. And then these are some of the other competing options in the market right now. So Lian Li has the whole O11 lineup. They've been making them for years at this point. And that is sort of, it's not the inventor of the idea of a dual chamber case. It's been around a long time. Corsair actually made a very popular one back in around 2013 or so, 2014 might have been, that I covered. And since then, it has kind of bloomed as this whole separate archetype in the industry, thanks to the O11D originally repopularizing it. Then we'll go look at some older Be Quiet cases too, like this one. So Patrick and I have been reviewing Be Quiet cases since at least 2014. We've been doing this a long time. Heavy use of foams and dampers and things like that. I just read Patrick's note from possibly 10 years ago. Before that, this video is brought to you by Squarespace, and visiting squarespace.com/gamersnexus will give you 10% off your first purchase with them. We've built a number of our own websites with Squarespace, where we list catastrophic PC hardware failures to inform subscribers of those failures. We also built our store website with Squarespace using its built-in e-commerce tools, and of course, we built a website for our CEO, Snowflake, because she demanded our audience know who really runs the show. Get to the core of your idea and spend less time on web design by signing up at squarespace.com/gamersnexus or click the link below. So there's 2 versions of this case. We didn't review the 900, but it's all the same stuff. It just scales up larger. Thermals will be a little different. Core concepts are the same. The features more or less are the same. There's actually a couple of exceptions there, and we'll talk about that briefly today. But we're focusing on the 600. And here's the thing with how these feet work. I'm going to throw them on just for the shoot, but there's 3 slots of feet. So you're only ever going to use 2. You're supposed to use the outer 2 here, but there's also this inner slot, which you shouldn't use if you're going to put it on this side, although it's still stable. That's just because these panels are symmetrical, top and bottom. So it allows Be Quiet to flip this panel to the other side, and then that becomes the outside. You think of it like flipping it inside out or something. And then the other one goes up here, but this should go down here if it's going to stand on this side of the case, whereas that one ends up redundant. So you're always going to have one set of redundant feet that technically shouldn't be used like in this configuration, but we'll just go ahead and use these and show you how it ends up stable anyway. It's just that's a redundant set for if the panel flips because it's symmetrical. Is this plugged in? We're going to find out. Nope. So currently, if we spin around here, I've put the feet on what would be the traditional top. So you see they're a little bit of play in them, which is something we're going to go over today in the fit and finish. But once it's stationary, it should more or less just stay put. So that's really how the core feature looks. Because this case is designed to be positioned 3 different ways, the thermal situation is pretty interesting. Currently, it just happens to be inverted. That puts the cooler closest to the intake at the bottom, if it is a bottom to top, and it also orients the GPU exhaust, so that's kind of blowing this way. Now, alternatively, if it's back the other way it was back there a second ago, what we end up with is a potential side-to-side. So you can do intake on either side, pull it through and do exhaust through the other side. We have a lot of thermal testing to do today for configuration. So this case, again, is up against a ton of competition. Some of the key ones include those we looked at a second ago, like Lian Li's O11 series. These days, this includes a lot of things. There's the Vision, there's the Evo series, there's the XL series, there are other variants. And this jump-started this entire trend. The Hyte Y60 and Y70 have come down in price. The Y70 non-touch is still more expensive than the light-based 600 though. The Y60 is cheaper than it, and that's the different take on the concept of the cut corner. That was picked up by NDXT. They have the H5, H7, and H9 cases. They vary in their similarities, but they share some concepts. Montech's King series cases, but especially the 95, have an affordable dual chamber option that competes with the light base. Then Antec C8 cases are relatively good performers thermally. So you get the idea. It's a crowded segment. At $150, it's more competitive. It's just that it's empty. There's no fans. At the $195 price, which is what this one is that we're reviewing, that includes the 4 120mm fans and all the LED and everything else. It's also got these. There's some hubs hidden. There's one right there. And then there's another one up top in there. So that kind of brings the cost of the case up. Externally, the case also has a giant light bar that wraps around the case. That's probably where the name comes from. This was done in this particular way so that Be Quiet could achieve the rotation without losing symmetry when you move the case around. In fact, all of this case had to be designed with that symmetry in mind. That's what gives the cheaper flexibility than the more mechanically intensive inversion processes from other cases. But it's also limiting in some areas. For the basics, our version includes 4 120mm fans pre-installed as side intake and rear exhaust when in traditional configuration. You could also shift these to the bottom as intake fans in traditional orientation, or if rotated flat, they could be used as a side-to-side flow path. This on its own is pretty interesting, and it's one of the tests we ran. Other small fit and finish issues include this panel gap between the glass front and side, which is large enough that you'd need a taxi if you had to get from one side to the other. The glass panels also diverge as they approach the bottom, with the bottom edge protruding slightly despite a relatively flush top edge. We've got a couple other fit and finish complaints later as well. But let's get into the big details. Now in the past, we've criticized Be Quiet for its complicated case inversion processes. The Darkbase Pro 900, for example, took us 45 minutes to figure out initially with disassembly and reassembly and sorting through the ridiculous variety of screws and amount of them and other hardware. Be Quiet, though, must have taken that criticism to heart, even if 7 years later, because the Lightbase 600 can be inverted in under 10 seconds with no real screws at all, just the case feet. Now, the design doc says 30 seconds, but that's with the system inside. The case feet are pulled off by rotating them about 90 degrees. They hook into a slot in a specific location in the panels. Now, this solution isn't perfect because the feet don't lock and they go crooked as soon as you slide the case around or set it down initially. You'll have to reposition them once it's in the final spot. They also feel fragile enough to damage by hand if positioned in the wrong spot to initially insert. The ease of use, though, outweighs the downsides, we think. It's just that the downsides were avoidable in design. Either way, once it's done, these concerns go away. This case also includes one of the simplest vertical GPU conversion systems that we've seen. You take out all the horizontal slot covers, screw a bar across the back of the case, and adjust the built-in GPU support down a couple of notches. The horizontal orientation is the most unique in the current era of computing, though it definitely used to be the standard. The old style is actually so liked in the retro scene that Silverstone made an April Fool's case that accidentally became popular enough that there's some real demand to get it made. Now, the downside is that the Lightbase 600 isn't a particularly small case. It's not huge by modern standards, but because it can be laid flat, it ends up with a 32 centimeter dimension this way, which actually, you know what, I apologize. I said centimeters. There's a comment about 7.5 years ago that said, "You're American, why don't you use American units?" So, in other words, it is approximately 75% of 1 cubit wide, or is about 4 palm widths, or let me just 0.001515 repeating furlongs. It's not petty if it's accurate. The 900 has even larger dimensions, so this might pose some challenges for that true desktop orientation. Backed against a wall, the case requires a minimum of 50 centimeters up to the front edge of the case, requiring a deeper table to comfortably accommodate a keyboard and a mouse if placed directly in front of the case. Now, you don't have to position it that way, but if that's what you want, you need to plan ahead and make sure the table's deep enough. The dimensions make it impractical to use for most tables in the old IBM PC layout, but if you want to try it anyway, we recommend using a monitor arm rather than resting the weight on the glass panel. We wouldn't recommend setting it up with the monitor directly on it, especially since tempered glass can shatter without impact and seemingly randomly in some situations, mostly from harmonics. With the total monitor arm and monitor configuration, the setup could be made to look pretty unique, and we like the concept like this. Most of our desks here are either 24 inches or 30 inches deep, with a few at 2 cubits for filming. With that old school setup with the computer right in front of the user, the 1.5 cubit deep desks would only have 10 inches or 25 centimeters to spare for a keyboard and mouse. assuming a keyboard no longer than 1.5 IBM Model M's. This table is 0.000762 kilometers deep, but it gives you an idea for sizing. You could definitely build a good-looking retro setup with the right color, lighting, and furniture. Not that the 600 is confined to that style, but it'd look good. You would just need a deeper table. Back to the fan and LED hubs though. So this case has 2 of them. And so one of those is up top, up there. And then the other one, as we showed earlier, is hidden down here. Now this is the Lightbase 600 LX. The LX is because it has 4 fans, and that means that it's already consuming 4 of the slots for each of those. So there's 8 pairs remaining. There's no daisy chaining with the fans included in the LX. Now this allows for 2 separate zones. Our key focus is performance, but when LEDs are done, we still look for quality. We think the lighting on this is executed excellently. The diffuser bars work well, and the LED animations are smooth. Looks good in a nighttime or lights out setup. Out of the box, all the LEDs are set to Be Quiet orange. The manual provides a full table of built-in lighting effects and instructions for syncing with external input. We thought the manual was well written for this. The cabling for the stock ARGB fans is a little overwhelming, but the light bars and their associated wires are tucked completely out of the way. One complaint we had was that the LED button and the reset button are exactly the same size and they don't have any labels, though you'd probably only make that mistake once. The Lightbase 600 is another case without a support pillar between its 2 glass panels, giving us a top panel that could theoretically be bent down. In practice, the top and bottom panels are interlocked with the front panel, keeping it solid as long as the case is assembled. The steel side panel is fully ventilated. The only areas it's truly necessary would be where the power supply are and the fans are, but they've got the whole thing ventilated. And then inside it has a removable filter. And we actually like the mechanism for this. It's very straightforward, but it just basically snaps in and out of place. It's got these sort of notches up here where you can notch it in and back out. So we did like that. This is actually an improvement on some of the competition right now in the more traditional form factor. So for example, the Haven HS420, which is a case we liked overall, unfortunately it has glued its filter in for the side panel, which is obnoxious because it makes it a lot harder to take it out and clean it. Same goes for some of Hyte's cases where they have them secured with glue. So this is an improvement for what Be Quiet's doing. Now, unfortunately, the top and bottom filters aren't as flexible and they're built into their respective panels. If you set up a horizontal build, some fans will be forced to exhaust through a filter that isn't intended to be removed, which just creates unnecessary impedance. Primary radiator support in traditional orientation is at the top and bottom of the case, which both support up to 360mm sizes. 360mm radiators aren't officially supported in the side mount, and most won't fit at all with the 39.6 centimeters of clearance between the top and bottom of the case. The Lightbase 600 does have cutouts though for back connect motherboards, although normal ATX boards overlap with the cutouts along the bottom edge. Small fan and I/O cables can be snaked through the back connect holes anyway, but we expect clear, premeditated cable routes. The storage behind the motherboard is deep, as is typical for dual chamber cases. It's just that it can be difficult to work in once the space is occupied by cables. The cable tie points are hard to reach once power supply cables are in the way. For this particular case, we don't always see that. And the cable cover, the hard drive bracket, and fan and lighting hubs contribute to the cramped feeling. We ended up just sort of wadding all the cables up into the channels and snapping the cable cover shut on top. It's still easier than the LANcool 207 at least. We'd like to see a way to screw the cable cover down, but the cable channel is deep enough that it's unlikely to be necessary. Drive storage is a complicating factor for cable management. The stock Lightbase 600 only supports 2 2.5-inch drives and 1 3.5-inch drive, with 2 smaller drives mounted to the cable cover, which requires leaving enough slack to open it. The stock bottom bracket can only mount a single 3.5-inch drive, but it has room for a Be Quiet HDD Cage 2, which is separate DLC purchasing. That fits an additional 3.5 or 2 2.5-inch drives. And finally, using the bottom bracket at all reduces access to cable cutouts and one of the 2 fan and lighting hubs. Now the 900 would open some of this up, but again, it's bigger, and probably some of the cramped feeling we get in the back of the case is just because they're trying to make it so when it's on its side, it doesn't feel too ridiculous. Back to some of the fit and finish stuff. So that gap between the 2 glass panes is interesting because it's definitely intentional and definitely known. They shipped the case with a strip of cardboard shoved into that gap. The gaps where the light bars meet, the top and the bottom, definitely aren't intentional, and Be Quiet didn't do anything to really minimize that. Now this is the most brightly lit, attention-grabbing area of the case, and it needs to look perfect. The gaps don't belong on a $195 case the way ours is set up, and the deviation at the top and bottom edges of the glass makes for messy execution where other areas are done to a higher standard. The panel gap isn't great for looks, but it could also contribute to dust ingress. It's that big, especially in a horizontal orientation, which would be exposed directly up. We all know how dust collects on glass surfaces. Some smaller points we want Be Quiet to address in future iterations would be the power supply fitment, which is unnecessarily tight to the point where it's harder than necessary getting it installed. Second would be, even though the GPU support works when the case is inverted, it may be weaker since it can't be flipped. So now we get into thermal section. This is the part that I like the most for the case reviews. There are 3 reverse blade fans in here for the model we got stock on the side, and then there's a traditional fan on the back. We have a few key configurations of the Light Base 600 that we're testing today. There's stock, which is standing in its traditional orientation with the included fans where they come. There's stock without a side filter, inverted, which is self-evident, flat with the fans left where they were, which becomes bottom intake. For the horizontal case testing, we removed the rubber bumpers in the side panel and we installed the feet in those slots. If we were testing the case without the feet there and just on the rubber bumpers, then the bottom intake would be completely suffocated and far worse than what you're going to see at our test. And then we also have flat with left intake and right exhaust. We'll start with a chart of just the Light Base results to make it easy. With all the case fans at full speed, the Light Base 600LX averaged 48 degrees Celsius above ambient all core and 52 on the P cores as default configuration. Removing the optional filter reduced the all core temperature by 1.7 degrees, which is actually a large drop for a side filter only. It's relatively restrictive. Fully inverting the case didn't change the temperatures enough to exit margin of error, which is encouraging since for the most part it shouldn't. The GPU would be prone to the most change here. Flipping the case on its side definitely hurt CPU thermal performance with an all-core average of 51 and P-core of 55. Left in the stock positions, the 3 intake fans end up obstructed by the desk surface when the case is put on its side. We intended to fix that with the left intake, right exhaust horizontal configuration, but with a focus on GPU thermals. So CPU thermals didn't change significantly versus the first horizontal result. You can see that here. Flipping the case on its side with the intake fans against the desk surface also raised the noise level up to 32.1 dBA versus 30.9 in the stock or inverted configurations. This is actually noticeable, and it's also really cool because previously our less precise testing approach to acoustics wouldn't have been able to surface this difference in numbers even though you would be able to hear it as a human. That's because we were limited previously by the noise floor and the measurement tools, and now with our hemi-anechoic chamber that the audience has helped us build with store purchases and things like that, Patreon support, we can actually detect with tools what the human ear can already hear, or closer to it anyway. That's why we have this chamber. People often forget that ears are incredible at their job and that representing it with a microphone is very difficult. So when people ask why we'd build such a chamber, this is exactly the reason. It is an awesome scientific representation of why we wanted it. We can get closer to measuring what you can perceive, but can't necessarily explain with numbers using less precise methods. Here's the full chart. It's fitting that Be Quiet's case is among the quietest on the chart when at 100% speed, bracketed by the Hyte Y60 at 30.1 dBA and the Fractal Pop Air by 31.3, but there are no obvious noise damping features other than use of the Lightwings fans. This all comes down to how many fans they use and how fast they run stock. The Y60 may be equally quiet, but it's also much hotter with just the stock fans, averaging 51 degrees all-core versus the 600LX's 48. So that is an advantage for the LX. We know based on past experience that the Antec C8 is the dual chamber case to beat in terms of overall thermals. 46 degrees in this particular test for that one, albeit with a higher noise level, 37.1 dBA, while the glass-fronted King 95 Pro averaged 43 degrees at 36.8. We'll get to noise-normalized thermals in a moment. GPU full speed is up now. The Light Base 600LX kept our GPU at 52 degrees Celsius above ambient with the memory temperature at 60 and the hotspot at 68. Removing the side filter improved the temperatures by 2.2 degrees for the GPU, which is a huge climb for just a filter. Be Quiet has room to improve this area. Inversion had a mildly negative effect, raising the GPU average to 54 degrees. The horizontal configuration was worse still at 55 degrees for the GPU, 63 for the memory, and 71 for the hotspot. Keeping the case horizontal but shifting to the left intake right exhaust config dramatically lowered the temperatures down to 41 GPU, 44 memory, and 53 hotspot. This is the equivalent of a bottom intake configuration in a case that's oriented normally, but with unobstructed intake. Here's the competitive chart. All the results with the fans and their stock locations are among the weakest on the chart, with the baseline out-of-the-box results falling behind even the Y60. The left intake right exhaust configuration performed significantly better, tying the C8 ARGB's 41-degree GPU average and significantly outperforming the King 95 Pro's 46-degree average. And this, remember, was done with just the fans included with the case. All we did was move them. We didn't want to add fans because it just starts to become arbitrary and potentially unfair, but moving them really helped here. The horizontal configuration has the greatest potential for cooling, since a clear unidirectional airflow path can be created without obstruction. You're not dealing with angled intake from the side and bouncing the air around or changing its direction. So there's a huge amount of potential here. The Light-based 600LX's low noise at full speed means it has a shot in our noise-normalized test, where all case fans are tuned down to hit our 27 dBA threshold. We normalize these in our hemi-anechoic chamber to get the granularity needed for a fair test. 50 degrees Celsius above ambient all-core and 54 P-core ties the Antec C8 ARGB, but the King 95 Pro averaged 47 all-core, and cases with simple front intake like the Antec Flux Pro and the Lian Li O11 continue to dominate the top of this chart. GPU thermal performance was already weak with the case fans at full speed, and with reduced fan speeds, the 600LX is the hottest case on this chart, other than the King 65 Pro. This is a strong argument for the horizontal left to right airflow configuration. These are all at the same noise levels. We've normalized them for this, so it's just not a good result for Be Quiet. Up next is our standardized fan testing. Because we were forced to mount the 140mm fans in the bottom of the case for our standardized test, we have an opportunity to see the case's bottom intake performance. An average GPU temperature of 44 degrees above ambient is more competitive than the other GPU thermal results we've seen for the 600LX so far. It's close to the King 95 Pro and the C8 ARGB's tied 43-degree averages, but that still only places the LX in the middle of the chart. This is also effectively a test of the light-based 600DX, since we would have performed all tests on that case using our standardized set of fans like this. Finishing off with VRM and system memory thermals during noise-normalized testing, the 600LX's performance is again unimpressive. 35 degrees above ambient for the VRM is warmer than the C8 ARGB's 33 degrees and the King 95 Pro's 31 degrees, and although the stack is ordered differently for memory temperatures, both the C8 ARGB and King 95 Pro were cooler than the 600LX's 27 degrees. We also know from our full speed results that these sensors didn't respond strongly to the horizontal left intake right exhaust configuration. So the Light-based 600LX with the fans is on the expensive side of cases like this, where it's a little bit larger, it's dual chamber, it has fans included, and that makes it, you're really buying this for looks. There's other aspects we'll talk about, but the key competition for the thermal side would be the Antec C8 and the King 95 Pro. Both of those cases also have fanless SKUs that are cheaper than the fanless SKUs of the Light-based, at least right now when we're filming this. So the primary reason you might want to buy a Light-based 600 over any of those options, including the Antec H9 Flow, which we haven't tested, would be the wraparound light bar. We're at least happy to see that the light bar looks good in person. It has bright, evenly diffused LEDs. It was critical that they executed on this feature well, and they did do a good job on it, with a couple caveats being sort of the fit and finish stuff like the panel flushness. Now, the horizontal option is also a very unique selling point. It's one that few people will have the desk space to try, but this is a well-liked presentation layout. It ends up looking better than you might expect when looking at it vertically, and it's a unique feature that is also executed overall very well. It's mechanically simple. I mean, you put it on the side, you take the feet off. It's about as straightforward as it gets. You'll just have to plan your furniture a little more than typical, but it's not the hardest thing in the world to do. And once you're aware of the sizing, it can be worked with. If you do buy a Light-based 600 and you want to maximize the thermal performance, we actually would suggest using the horizontal configuration with side intake fans pushing directly into the GPU and exhaust fans pulling the hot air out the opposite side. We already covered kind of all the pros and cons of the case throughout the review, but coming back to one of them, the feet are very mechanically trivial and they work great in most ways. The way they really work well is just the installation, removal, flipping the whole case. That's awesome. They need some work, so they don't really latch in well enough where when you're moving the case around, like when you first put it on the desk, you can't really do any pivoting with it like you might do on a foot of another case. just because these will move, and they move pretty easily. So we'd like to see them continue to refine this, because one more kind of plastic component to latch it would make it really solid. It would hold it in place, but still make it easily removable. So they're on a great path with this straightforward, simple solution to invert a case. It has never been easier for us to invert a case. It's just that we want to see that sort of stability improve when you're moving the case around. A couple things to be aware of if you're building in this. So on the AIO or closed loop liquid cooler side, if you're doing a liquid cooler, remember that it's always the case that you don't want the pump to be the highest point in the loop. That hasn't changed. However, when you put the case on its side like this, it becomes the bottom to put the radiator down here. It would be the side typically. That would put the radiator lower than the pump if the pump is in the block. So if you have a pump in block solution, which is still most of them on the market, meaning something that doesn't have the pump in the radiator, you'd want to put the radiator on one of the sides. It could go on either side because it's flat now, so either one would work. But just don't put it down in what would have been the side intake, aka now the bottom. It's good to see some movement from Be Quiet. They've been stagnant for a long time in cases. The back connect compatibility is fairly new. Dual chamber cases and ARGB LEDs are not. They are years old trends now. And likewise, it'll take them some time to become a leader in cases again rather than a follower. They've also deviated from some of the expectations of Be Quiet, which is not a bad thing. Fractal deviated too, and it worked out great for them. We like the case overall. It's a unique presentation. It is mechanically simple and it works well. And aside from that, there are no revolutionary changes to the build process. There's no exceptional new features. It's kind of just normal, just it can be set different orientations. This case clears the basic bars, so it comes down to looks. And if you're a big fan of the layout, we're really not seeing any major detractors or major reasons to advise against the purchase of the light-based series. In other words, if you like how this looks, it seems fine with us. It's an overall acceptable case to good in some execution and mechanical aspects, with some areas for improvement. So how's that for a pedantic nerd answer? That's it for this one. Thanks for watching. It was fun to work on. We're happy to see Be Quiet executing well on a couple of these new to them features, and looking forward to see where they go with it, because there's some clear paths to improvement and they're not too hard to execute on. So subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to grab some of our dice. We have dice sets with inductors embedded for, they're actually e-waste inductors that are embedded in the dice. Then we have another one that are snowflake dice sets with my cat Snowflake modeled as a sort of caricature of herself and in the dice. So you can grab those on the store. They also come with these cards in a legally distinct but stylized fashion similar to Magic. So you can use them in your non-tournament play. Goblin token you might be able to use in a tournament though. That's it. Thanks for watching. We'll see you all next time.